At 10:17 a.m., I sat across from HR with my badge already deactivated, waiting to be fired. Then the CEO walked in holding a 43-page audit report, looked at my manager, and asked one question: "Would you like to explain why her name is on none of this?" My manager had spent 6 months building a case to remove me. He had emails, performance notes, and a speech about professional fit. What he did not know is that I had been documenting something much bigger than my own treatment. By the end of that meeting, I kept my job, and he lost far more than his title. Every story here is about someone who got underestimated and made them regret it. My name is Lauren Price, and for 6 years, I worked for a medical supply company called Acadia Clinical Solutions. Acadia supplied hospitals, surgery centers, urgent care networks, and rehabilitation clinics. We sold the things nobody thinks about until they are missing: sterile gloves for supplies, surgical kits, diagnostic equipment, patient monitoring devices, emergency stock. The products that need to arrive correctly, on time, and in the right quantities, because a delayed order is not just an inconvenience. It can cancel procedures. It can close departments. It can force a hospital to use more expensive emergency suppliers. That was why Acadia had built its reputation around reliability. Or at least, that was the reputation it wanted to have. My role was Senior Contract Operations Manager. I managed the operational side of our largest hospital agreements. I reviewed pricing schedules. I tracked purchase commitments. I monitored delivery performance. I coordinated with sales, finance, warehouse operations, and customer service. And when a hospital noticed something wrong with an invoice, a shipment, or a contract renewal, I was usually the person called into the room to find the answer before the client lost confidence. I was not in sales. I did not get applause at quarterly meetings. I did not fly around the country making presentations with polished slides and big promises. I did the part that came after the promise. The part where someone had to make sure the company could actually deliver what had been sold. That work was quiet. Until it was not. Acadia's biggest contract was with a regional hospital group called North Valley Health Network. North Valley operated 18 hospitals across 3 states. Their annual agreement with Acadia was worth just over $31 million. They bought everything from surgical materials to emergency inventory support. And because their system included both large urban hospitals and smaller rural facilities, their contract was complicated. Some locations received daily deliveries. Some received weekly deliveries. Some maintained large reserves. Others relied on rapid replenishment because they did not have storage space. One missed delivery could be manageable at a major hospital. At a small rural facility, the same missed delivery could become a crisis by noon. I had managed North Valley's operational account for 4 years. I knew their procurement director. I knew their chief supply chain officer. I knew which hospital administrators wanted a phone call before an email. I knew which sites had emergency inventory agreements. I knew that their contract had a strict service level clause. If Acadia failed to meet its fulfillment standards too often, North Valley could demand credits, reduce volume, or open the agreement for competitive rebid. That clause was worth paying attention to. My manager did not think so. His name was Richard Voss. Richard was Vice President of Commercial Operations. He had joined Acadia after the company acquired a smaller competitor, and from his first week, he acted like everyone who had been there before him had built the company incorrectly. He was 47, polished, ambitious, and always arrived exactly 4 minutes late to meetings. Not 3. Not 5. 4. Then he would walk in with a coffee, sit down slowly, and make everyone wait while he opened his notebook. It was a small thing, but it told you everything. Richard wanted people to notice when he entered a room. He wanted authority to feel physical. His favorite phrase was, "We need to control the narrative." If a client complained, Richard did not first ask what happened. He asked how the complaint had been communicated. If a warehouse missed a shipment, he did not ask whether the process had failed. He asked whether sales had managed expectations. If I raised concerns about contract performance, he would lean back in his chair and say, "Lauren, we need to control the narrative." To Richard, the story was always more important than the facts. That worked for him at first. Acadia's executive team liked confidence. They liked clean explanations. They liked hearing that a problem was isolated, temporary, or being addressed. Richard gave them those phrases. I gave them data. And data is not always welcome when it tells people that a smooth story is hiding a rough reality. The trouble started after Acadia changed its warehouse routing software. The change was supposed to improve delivery speed. Instead, it created small fulfillment errors. Orders would appear complete in the system, but one item might be missing. A shipment would be marked delivered, but the receiving department would have received only part of it. A facility would get the right product, but the wrong quantity. At first, the errors were scattered. 3 orders in Ohio, 2 in Indiana, 1 in Wisconsin. Nothing dramatic. But I noticed a pattern. The missing items were mostly high-priority products. Surgical drapes, sterile kits, monitoring leads. Products that were stored in separate warehouse zones and often picked after the larger items had already been scanned. The system was closing orders too early. I documented the issue. I opened internal tickets. I sent weekly reports. I asked Richard for permission to notify North Valley that we were reviewing a fulfillment discrepancy. He refused. He said notifying them would create unnecessary concern. I said the client would create more concern if they discovered a pattern before we told them. He said, we need to control the narrative. I asked him whether he had read the North Valley service level clause. He smiled. Then he said, Lauren, you manage operations. Let leadership manage the relationship. That was the moment I understood the real problem. Richard did not think my work was important because it did not look important from his office. He saw delivery reports. I saw promises. He saw percentages. I saw a hospital waiting for supplies. Then, in late August, I found something that changed everything. The fulfillment errors were not random. They were being manually reclassified. Every week, North Valley received a performance report showing that Acadia was meeting its delivery standards. But deep inside the internal records, I found a separate set of adjustments that made late or incomplete shipments disappear before the client ever saw them. Richard thought I was building a file about missed orders. He did not realize I was building a record of who had been hiding them. At first, I assumed the reclassifications were legitimate. Sometimes a delivery issue is not a delivery issue. A hospital may reject an order because the receiving dock was closed. A product may arrive on time but be held because the facility did not process it correctly. A shipment may be delayed because the client changed an address or requested a different delivery window. Those situations should not count against Acadia's performance. That is why the adjustment process existed. But proper adjustments required documentation, a written explanation, a supporting note, a client acknowledgement when appropriate, and approval from contract operations. That approval was supposed to come through my team. Except it was not. I started comparing North Valley's external performance reports against the internal exception logs. The first difference was small. A delivery to North Valley Central Hospital had arrived 14 hours late. The external report showed client scheduling variance. The internal delivery record showed no schedule change. The receiving dock had been open. The driver had simply been routed to the wrong entrance and waited until the delivery window closed. The second difference was more serious. A shipment of sterile procedure kits to one of North Valley's rural hospitals had arrived incomplete. The external report showed partial acceptance completed. The internal notes showed the hospital had received the shipment, called Acadia, and reported that 22 kits were missing. That was not partial acceptance. That was an incomplete order. Then I found a third example, and a fourth, and a fifth. Each one had been reclassified under broad categories like customer variance, carrier exception, or service level exclusion. Those categories sounded official, but the explanations beneath them were thin. Sometimes they were one sentence. Sometimes they were blank. Sometimes the same wording appeared across completely unrelated locations. Customer operations caused delay. Site-specific intake issue. Delivery conditions outside Acadia control. The language was too clean, too repetitive, too convenient. I checked the approval records. Every adjustment had been approved by someone in Richard's commercial operations group. Not my team. Not warehouse operations. Not legal. Richard's group. That did not prove Richard personally knew what was happening. But it proved that someone had decided client performance mattered less than the report describing it. I did what I had always done. I documented it. I created a private work folder in Acadia's approved compliance platform. Not on my personal computer. Not on a flash drive. Not anywhere I should not have used. I saved the internal exception reports, the external scorecards, the approval trails, the email requests, the shipping records, and the contract language requiring accurate performance reporting. Then I sent a factual note to Richard. I wrote, I have identified multiple North Valley fulfillment events classified as service-level exclusions without supporting evidence. Because the contract includes audit and reporting provisions, I recommend an immediate internal review before the September scorecard is issued. He replied 6 minutes later. Thank you. I will handle it. That was all. 2 weeks passed. The September scorecard went out. It showed Acadia meeting its contract standards at 98.6%. North Valley's procurement director replied with a short message. Please confirm whether this report includes all fulfillment exceptions identified by our hospital sites. Richard responded before I could. Yes. The report reflects the complete and mutually agreed performance picture. That email made my stomach drop. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was specific. Complete. Mutually agreed. Neither statement was true. North Valley had not agreed to those exclusions. And the report did not include every fulfillment exception. Richard had put a false narrative in writing. That was his first visible mistake. The lie was no longer hidden inside a spreadsheet. It had been sent directly to the client. I requested a meeting with Richard. He delayed it twice. When we finally met, he came in 4 minutes late, carrying coffee. He sat down, opened his notebook, looked at me, and said, "What is so urgent?" I showed him the examples. I showed him the contract clause. I showed him the scorecard. I said, North Valley is asking whether our report includes all exceptions. We need to correct this before they find the discrepancy themselves. Richard did not look concerned. He looked irritated. He said, "You are overreacting." I said, "The figures are inaccurate. They are adjusted. They are unsupported. They are commercially managed." I paused. Then I said, "Are you saying we can exclude any failure if it makes the account look better?" His face changed. Just slightly. He leaned forward. "Be careful with your wording." I said, "I am being careful. That is why I am asking." He closed his notebook. Then he said, "Lauren, your role is to solve operational issues. You are not compliance. You are not legal. You are not an executive. Stop trying to create a problem where there is none." There it was. The warning. Not about the data. About my place. Richard did not want an answer. He wanted obedience. I left the meeting and wrote a recap email. Not emotional. Not accusatory. I listed the records we had discussed. I asked whether he wanted me to initiate an internal review. Then I included one final sentence. Please confirm whether you are directing me to take no further action regarding the unsupported service level exclusions. He did not answer. But at 6:41 p.m. that night, he forwarded my email to HR. I know because HR accidentally copied me on the reply. The subject line was, "Concerns regarding Lauren's judgment." That was when I understood he was preparing something. Not a review. A removal. Over the next month, Richard began building his case. He told HR I was difficult to work with. He said I created tension with sales. He said I had become overly focused on technical reporting. He claimed I was damaging client confidence by escalating minor matters. Then he started excluding me from North Valley meetings. At first, I was removed from one weekly call. Then 2. Then all of them. The explanation was that Richard wanted streamlined communication. What he wanted was for me to stop hearing what the client was asking. But he made another mistake. He assumed my absence would make me less informed. Instead, it made the pattern clearer. North Valley began contacting our warehouse leaders directly. They asked why certain deliveries were missing from their own records, but not from Acadia's performance reports. One warehouse director, a man named Samuel Ortiz called me after hours. He had worked with me for years. He said, "Lauren, I do not know what is going on, but someone asked my team to change the closeout code on 3 North Valley orders." I asked who. He said the request came from commercial operations. I asked whether the request was in writing. He said yes. I told him to preserve it and follow company policy. I did not tell him what to do with it. I did not ask him to send it to me. I simply reminded him that changing records without proper authorization was serious. The next day, Samuel reported it through Acadia's ethics hotline. He did not tell me he planned to. He did it because he was worried too. And when the compliance team started reviewing the issue, Richard panicked. He did not know Samuel had reported anything, but he knew I had been asking questions. So he accelerated his plan. On a Thursday afternoon, I received a calendar invitation for Friday at 10 a.m. The subject line said, "Performance discussion." HR was included. Richard was included. My badge stopped working at 9:45 a.m. the next morning. That told me the meeting was not a discussion. It was a decision. I sat in the lobby for 15 minutes while security tried to resolve an access issue. Then an HR coordinator came down and escorted me upstairs. I had worked there 6 years. I had never been escorted anywhere. But I stayed calm. I had expected this. Not because I wanted it. Because people who rely on hidden stories often try to remove the person who knows where the facts are. At 10 a.m., I walked into conference room B. Richard was already there. HR was sitting beside him. My name was printed on a folder in front of each chair. And Richard had a prepared statement. I could tell. His hands were placed flat on the table. His coffee was untouched. For once, he had arrived early. That was when I knew he was nervous. Richard began reading from the folder. He said Acadia had concerns about my approach to cross-functional collaboration. He said I had repeatedly escalated issues outside my role. He said I had caused friction with leadership. He said my conduct showed a pattern of resisting strategic direction. The words were polished, careful, built to sound serious without saying anything specific. I listened without interrupting. Then HR asked whether I had anything to say. I said I would like copies of the performance concerns being cited, the dates they occurred, and the evidence supporting them. Richard looked at HR. HR looked back at him. Then she said the company would provide the documentation. I asked, before or after my employment is terminated? Richard's expression tightened. He said, "Lauren, this meeting is not productive if you are going to be adversarial." I said, "Asking for the facts is not adversarial." He leaned back. Then he used the phrase he had been using for months. "We need to control the narrative." For the first time, I let myself look directly at him. I said, "That is exactly what concerns me." The room went quiet. Richard started to respond. Then the conference room door opened. The CEO walked in. Behind her was Acadia's general counsel. Behind him was the chief compliance officer. And in the CEO's hand was a thick blue folder. Richard stood halfway from his chair. "Marissa," he said, "I was not aware you were joining us." The CEO did not answer him. She walked to the end of the table and placed the folder in front of Richard. Then she said, "Would you like to explain why Lauren's name is on none of this?" It was 10:17 a.m. I remember because the clock on the wall was directly behind Richard. He looked down at the folder. His face changed. The blue folder was the audit report. 43 pages. The compliance review Samuel had triggered had grown much larger than Richard expected. It included the altered performance classifications, the unsupported exclusions, the emails from commercial operations asking warehouse staff to change closeout codes, the scorecards sent to North Valley, and the approval records showing Richard's department had authorized 67 reclassifications over 4 months. Not 1 or 2. 67. The chief compliance officer opened the report. Then she read one line aloud. On September 9th, Vice President Richard Voss instructed commercial operations personnel to classify fulfillment failures as client-driven exceptions unless documentation expressly prohibited the classification. Richard tried to speak. "That is being taken out of context." The general counsel said, "Then please provide the context." Richard looked at me. Not with anger. with disbelief. He thought I had done this. He thought I had set a trap. But I had not. I had followed company policy. I had documented what I saw. I had asked questions. I had written accurate recaps. And other people had seen the same thing because the truth had become too large to hide. The CEO turned to HR. Is this the employee you were preparing to terminate? HR looked down at her folder, then said quietly, yes. The CEO said, on what basis? HR began explaining the performance concerns Richard had submitted. The CEO held up her hand. Were those concerns independently reviewed before this meeting was scheduled? Nobody answered. That answer was enough. Richard started talking faster. He said the service level classifications had been commercial decisions. He said North Valley's account required flexibility. He said the company had always made judgment calls. Then the chief compliance officer asked him one question. Why did you tell the client the report reflected a complete and mutually agreed performance picture when neither condition was true? Richard stopped. There are moments when someone realizes the language they use to control everyone else has become evidence against them. That was one of those moments. He said, I was trying to protect the account. The general counsel said, by giving the client inaccurate information? He said, by managing a sensitive situation. The CEO said no. By hiding a sensitive situation. Then she opened the audit report to page 29. There was an email from Richard to one of his managers. It said, if operations keeps reporting every miss as a failure, North Valley will use it against us. Reclassify what you can. We need the scorecard to support renewal. That was the line that ended him. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was clear. He had not made a mistake. He had created a process designed to hide the mistake. The CEO asked me to speak. I did not use the moment to insult Richard. I did not say I told you so. I did not talk about the way he had treated me. I said, North Valley deserves an accurate report and a recovery plan. Acadia needs to identify every affected delivery, correct the scorecards, and notify the client before they discover more discrepancies. We also need to protect the hospitals that may have been affected by incomplete shipments. The CEO nodded. Then she looked at Richard. You are suspended effective immediately pending further investigation. He stared at her. Then he said, you cannot be serious. She said, I am completely serious. He looked at HR. HR did not move. He looked at the general counsel. The general counsel was taking notes. Then Richard stood up. For the first time in 6 years, he did not have a phrase. No narrative. No polished answer. No way to make the facts smaller than they were. Security was called. Not because he caused a scene. Because that was the policy when an executive was suspended during an active compliance matter. The same policy that had deactivated my badge 15 minutes before a meeting built on accusations that had never been properly reviewed. Richard collected his phone, his notebook, his untouched coffee. Then he walked out. I watched him leave. And I felt something I had not expected. Not joy. Not rage. Relief. For months, I had been carrying the weight of knowing something was wrong while someone more powerful told me it was not my place to say so. That feeling disappeared the moment the truth entered the room. The meeting that was supposed to end my career became the beginning of Acadia's recovery. But recovery was not easy. North Valley had to be notified. The CEO called their chief supply chain officer that afternoon. She told them Acadia had identified discrepancies in performance reporting and had begun an internal investigation. She did not pretend it was minor. She did not blame a warehouse. She did not use the phrase isolated incident. North Valley was angry. Rightfully so. They requested a full review. They froze renewal discussions. They demanded that Acadia provide complete shipment records for the previous 6 months. The account was worth $31 million a year. And it was suddenly at risk. The CEO asked me to lead the operational recovery team. I accepted on one condition. The team would report directly to her and the chief compliance officer. No commercial executive could alter fulfillment classifications without written review from operations, compliance, and the client when required. She agreed. For the next 5 weeks, I worked longer days than I had in years. We reviewed 4,800 deliveries. We identified 67 reclassified exceptions. 23 were legitimate exclusions with incomplete documentation. 44 were unsupported. Of those 44, 12 involved incomplete shipments of high-priority medical supplies. Nothing had caused documented patient harm, but several facilities had been forced to use backup inventory or emergency suppliers. North Valley should have been told. They were not. We corrected the reports. We issued service credits. We created a direct escalation protocol for every hospital site. And we rebuilt the contract performance process from the ground up. North Valley did not terminate the agreement. Not immediately. But they reduced Acadia's volume commitment for the following year. The company lost approximately $6.2 million in projected revenue. That was the cost of Richard's narrative. But there was another cost too. The board reviewed his leadership record. They discovered he had used the same pressure tactics with other teams. Employees who raised concerns had been labeled difficult. Managers who asked for evidence had been excluded from meetings. His department had become a place where people learned to stay quiet if they wanted to stay employed. Richard was terminated for cause 2 weeks later. The official company announcement did not explain why. It simply said Acadia was making leadership changes to reinforce accountability and client trust. But the people who had worked under him understood. His downfall was not caused by one audit report. It was caused by every moment he chose appearances over accuracy. Every time he said, "Control the narrative," instead of "Find out what happened." Every time he treated a question like disloyalty. Every time he assumed the woman in operations would stay quiet because she did not have the title he did. At 4:38 p.m. on the day he was formally terminated, the CEO called me into her office. She offered me his job. Vice President of Commercial Operations. I thanked her. Then I said no. Not because I was afraid of responsibility. Because I did not want Richard's title. I wanted a role that reflected the work I actually did. So I proposed something else. Vice President of Contract Integrity and Client Operations. A role combining operational accountability, transparent reporting, and direct client recovery authority. The CEO took my proposal to the board. 3 weeks later, they approved it. And the first thing I did was remove the phrase, "control the narrative," from every leadership presentation. Not because words alone fix a company, but because the right words reveal what a company values. At Acadia, we stopped controlling narratives. We started telling the truth early enough to solve problems. The lesson is simple, but it is not easy. Document facts, not feelings. If something at work concerns you, write down dates, decisions, requests, and responses. Keep records through approved channels. Send calm follow-up emails after important conversations. Ask clear questions. Do not accuse people before you have evidence. Do not take confidential information you are not authorized to keep. Do not copy files to personal devices. But do not rely on memory when the stakes are high. A professional record can protect you when someone tries to turn a disagreement into a performance problem. And if you are being pushed out after raising legitimate concerns, understand the difference between being difficult and being diligent. You have the right to ask what standard is being applied to you. You have the right to request the basis for performance criticism. You have the right to ask for policies, examples, and documentation. Being untouchable does not mean no one can try to fire you. It means you work with enough integrity that when they try to rewrite what happened, the facts are already waiting. The goal is not revenge. The goal is to make truth easier to prove than a lie is to repeat. The next story begins with a company telling me I was just an account manager. They thought I handled one client, one contract, and one simple relationship. What they did not realize was that client represented 60% of their revenue, trusted me more than the executives, and had been quietly asking whether I would be willing to work somewhere else. Then they fired me on a Friday. By Monday morning, the client had made one call that changed the entire company. Subscribe, because when they finally understood who I had been managing, it was already too late.